Pearl Harbor was the United States Pacific Naval Base located in Hawaii. On the other side of the Pacific, Japan were creating their empire by invading Manchuria, part of China, and North and South Korea. Their next plan was to either invade part of the USSR or to spread into Southern Eastern Asian oil-rich countries. They tried to invade part of the USSR but failed, because now they have decided to invade American-held Southern Eastern Asian countries, but feared that America would declare war on them, so they decided to launch a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor to knock the US back.
The massive bombardment of Pearl Harbor began at 7:55 a.m. on the 7th December 1941. The Japanese killed 2,403 US servicemen and women and 68 civilians, and they only lost 129 of their own.
On Sunday, the 7th of December 1941, Pearl Harbor was attacked by the Imperial Japanese Navy service just before 8 a.m.
Pearl Harbor was the U.S. naval base located in Hawaii, Honolulu, Oahu Island. 2,400 people died and 1,148 people were left wounded due to the bombing.
Let's go back to the reason why Japan bombed Hawaii, Pearl Harbor.
Japan was a small country, so the short story is they wanted more land.
The Japanese thought the bombing would weaken America. The surprise attack by the Imperial Japanese Navy led the United States to declare war on Japan, making the US's entry into World War II, since they were a neutral country before.
Pearl Harbor by Mir and Flo. On the 7th of December 1941, the Japanese Empire attacked the USA. A date that will live forever. It was a surprise attack over oil. Japan wanted to interfere and take more territory. Favoured by the military, they wanted to go north and take Russia. After that failed, they chose south being Indonesia. They ended up in Hawaii, distracting the rest of the USA, hoping to gain power. The war ended when USA dropped atomic bombs on Japan. Japan lost around 450 aircraft, 29 planes destroyed, 5 sunken ships, and 64 people killed. And the USA, they took a big bump. 2,400 people died, 12 ships sunk, 1,778 people wounded, and 164 aircrafts were lost. This tragedy ended in 1945, making this a 4-year battle. This attack led to USA joining World War II, as Japan went quiet for the rest of the war. The massive attack on Pearl Harbor started November the 26th, 1941. There were 19 US naval ships that were damaged or sunk, 118 aircrafts that were destroyed, 2,218 killed, and 1,109 wounded. Here is the reason to why this happened. On November 26, 1941, the reason why Japan tried to attack Pearl Harbor was because the US Navy base was in Pearl Harbor, causing Japan wanting to attack there too. Destroy fleets of Navy supplies to try and take over smaller places the US owned. Japan wanted to get more territory and they did not have much natural resources such as oil and food, and wanted to get more of these. Japan was already planning to attack back in Japan months before they tried to bomb Pearl Harbor. Because of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the US decided to get more involved in World War II. The US ended the fight against Japan by sending an atomic bomb to a part of Japan. And that is what happened in Pearl Harbor.
On the 7th of December 1941, Japan surprise attacked Pearl Harbor at 7:55 on a Sunday morning. Pearl Harbor was an American lagoon on the islands of Ohio, Hawaii.
Pearl Harbour happened on the 7th of December 1941 at 8 a.m.
This also happened in Pearl Harbour, Hawaii.
The Japanese attacked to take over Pearl Harbour, so the Americans couldn't have Hawaii anymore.
Franklin D. Roosevelt said this is a day to remember for all his citizens.
So the Americans retaliated with the Battle of Midway in 1943.
The Americans were certainly not expecting this as a surprise attack.
Yes, Jacob, it was just a normal day in America. Until that happened.
The Japanese and the USA were in this terrifying incident.
Boom!
Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor because they wanted more room to attack the USA.
This is the beginning of the Pacific War.
A lot of people died in the Pearl Harbor because the Japanese either bombed them or killed them. Did you actually know it was 2,403 people who actually died? Retaliated really well. He started beating them up, but they eventually lost.
No, we didn't, Jacob. We won. The war finally ended in 1945, and that special day was called VE Day.
The attack on Pearl Harbour. The Pearl Harbour attack was on the 7th of December 1941 at 5 to 8. Pearl Harbour was a bombing attack on Hawaii by the Japanese. This was a fight against USA and Japan because Japan wanted Hawaii. This is a video of what happened that day.
Harbour by Amelie and Melina.
Sunday, December 7th, 1941 was supposed to be a day of rest for the military soldiers at Hawaii's Pearl Harbour, naval base on the island of Oahu, but at 8 a.m.
Japanese fighter planes zoomed in without warning and attacked the United States Pacific Fleet, or naval vessels. Mourned in the harbour, thousands of lives would be lost that day.
The plan. The sudden attack in Hawaii at the time, a territory of the United States, not a state, might have taken many by surprise, but the Japanese had been planning the operation for months.
Admiral Isoku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of Japanese Naval Forces and architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, didn't want to fight with America, but much of Europe and Asia, including Japan, were involved in World War II at the time. Yamamoto wanted to take over certain countries in Southeast Asia and use their oil to help fuel Japan's military vehicles and naval fleet. Repair crews went to work on the ships, except for USS Arizona, Utah, and Oklahoma. Every damaged ship returned to sea. The day after the attack, the United States declared war on Japan, officially entering World War II.
In the nearly 4 years that followed, the US Navy sank all of the Japanese aircraft carriers and battleships and cruisers that participated in the Pearl Harbor attack. The United States and its allies, Britain, France, and Russia, among other countries, eventually won the war, defeating Japan and its allies, Germany and Italy.
On Sunday, December the 7th, 1941, at 7:55 a.m., Japanese fighter planes surprised the United States Pacific Fleet that were moored in the harbour. Little did they know thousands of lives would be lost that day.
Admiral Yamamoto, who was the then Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Navy Force and who planned the attack on Pearl Harbor, didn't want to fight America.
But he wanted to take over certain countries to use their oil to help fuel Japan's military vehicles and naval fleet. But because the US base in Hawaii was close to these countries, the Japanese worried that the US would send soldiers from Pearl Harbor to defend the nations, so Yamamoto decided to move forward with a surprise attack. Following both attacks, 19 US naval vessels were damaged or sunk, 188 aircrafts were destroyed. In all, 2,280 servicemen and women were killed.
On Sunday, December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor attack was a moment in history. Admiral Yamamoto wanted to expand the Japanese empire further.
He had two plans, the northern plan, which was to take over Russia and China, which failed, and the southern plan, to take over Indonesia.
They decided that Indonesia was too risky, so they made a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor.
At 7:55 a.m.
He said he didn't want to fight with America.
November 26, 1941, they slipped from Japan to the North Pacific.
350 planes launched in two waves from Japan ships. The attack lasted 2 hours. Very long time. 188 aircraft destroyed, 2,280 servicemen and women killed, 1,109 wounded,
68 civilians killed. (1941) December the 7th, Sunday. That day was supposed to be a day of rest for the military soldiers at Hawaii's Pearl Harbor Naval Base on the island of Oahu. But Japan thought differently. Japanese fighter planes zoomed in without warning and attacked the United States Pacific Fleet. Thousands of lives would be lost that day.
The plan. The military soldiers resting at the Pearl Harbor were not expecting this surprise attack at all, but Japan had been planning the operation for months without anyone expecting a thing.
Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Naval Forces and architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, didn't want to fight with America, but much of Europe and Asia, including Japan, were involved in World War II at the time. Yamamoto wanted to take over certain countries in the southeastern Asia and use their oil to help fuel Japan's military vehicles and naval fleet. But because a US base in Hawaii was relatively close to these countries, the Japanese worried that the United States would send soldiers from Pearl Harbor to defend the nations if they were attacked. By destroying the US military presence in the region, the countries Japan wanted to target would be left vulnerable. So Yamamoto decided to move forward with a surprise attack on the US fleet in Hawaii.
So on November the 26th, 1941, 30 warships carrying fighter planes and bombers slipped from Japan into the North Pacific. They moved slightly until they closed in the Hawaii Islands. A small Japanese plane made a loop around the target and radioed back Pearl Harbor sleeps. The attack.
At dawn on December 7th, 350 planes launched in two waves from Japan ships. The bombers dropped bombs on American warships below, while the fighter planes targeted the US aircraft on the ground so they couldn't fight back.
Following both attacks, 19 US naval vessels were sunken or damaged. 188 aircraft were destroyed, and all 2,287 servicemen and women were killed. 1,109 were wounded, and 68 civilians, people who are not in military, also lost their lives. The attack lasted just under 2 hours.
And that is what happened to Pearl Harbour on December the 7th, 1941.
Pearl Harbour attack.
On Sunday, December 1941, Japanese warships released a two-wave attack on Pearl Harbor, part of the U.S.
Japan bombed the Pacific Fleet. Over 19 warships were sunk, 188 aircraft were destroyed, 2,280 people were killed, and 68 civilians were killed.
The reason that Pearl Harbor was bombed is because Japan had two plans. The first was to attack the USSR, but failed.
The second was to conquer Indonesia, which was at the time run by the US. This is why Pearl Harbor was attacked.
The US replied by bombing the two major cities in Japan, Nagasaki and Hiroshima, with atomic bombs.
This battle ended 1941, December 7th.
The end. Attack on Pearl Harbor. This attack was formed by the Japanese on December the 7th, 1941, where Admiral Izuki Yamato was in charge of this attack, along with 5 other captains.
This is a picture of the Pearl Harbor military base founded on November the 26th, 1941. 31 warships carrying fighter planes and bombers slipped from Japan into the North Pacific. They moved silently until they closed into the Hawaiian Islands.
As this battle ended, there were just under 2,500 people eliminated. 5 ships sunk and 30 planes were destroyed. The war ended when 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Japan. Attack on Pearl Harbor by Bobby and Lewis.
Pearl Harbor began on the 7th of December 1941.
The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor at 7:55 a.m.
Pearl Harbor involved Japan and America. Japan invaded America because they wanted more land.
Pearl Harbor lasted 2 long hours. These are some of the devastating effects of Pearl Harbor.
America lost over 2,000 men and 300 ships. Japan only lost 64 men.
The USA retaliated by the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
By Benji Harris and Jacob Roberts.
This was Pearl Harbor.
Pearl Harbor was situated in Honolulu, which is in Hawaii.
Pearl Harbor was a US Pacific Fleet.
The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor because they didn't want the US to plan any attacks on the Southeast Asian.
The attack happened on the 7th of December 1941, 7:55 in the morning.
The US were hit by surprise and many people were killed. In total, there were 2,400 deaths and 1,178 people were injured. 126 ships were sunk and 164 aircrafts were lost.
The leader of the Japanese fleet was Tojo Hideki at the time.
Another question is, who was involved? Well, the only people that were involved were the Japanese and the United States.
The way the Americans retaliated was by declaring war on Japan.
Another way the Americans retaliated was by joining World War II as an ally because the Japanese was an Axis.
The Japanese lost the war and America emerged victorious.
Americans said this day will be infamy, meaning it will not be forgotten. The Americans made the memorial for the sad events.
The attack on Pearl Harbor. The Pearl Harbor attack was on the 7th of December 1941 at 5 to 8. Pearl Harbor was a bombing attack on Hawaii by the Japanese. This was a fight against USA and Japan because Japan wanted Hawaii. This is a video of what happened that day.
Pearl Harbour is an American harbour on the island of Ohio, Hawaii, west of Honolulu.
On December the 7th, 1941, the US was a neutral country at the time.
The attack on Pearl Harbor was a surprise to the military base by the Imperial Japanese Navy.
The Japanese military launched torpedoes, bombs and guns on Pearl Harbor, and 2,400 people in Pearl Harbor were killed, and 1,178 wounded, 12 ships sunk, and 164 aircrafts lost.
For the Japanese, 64 people died, 5 wounded, and 29 aircrafts gone.
Japan intended the attack as a preventive action. It was aimed to prevent the United States Pacific Fleet from interfering with its planned military actions in the Southeast Asia against overseas territories of the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and those of the United States.
This was a terrible attack, both for the Japanese and US.
Pearl Harbor.
Pearl Harbor was a naval base in Hawaii, which was peaceful until 1941.
Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941 at 7:49 a.m.
Japan attacked Pearl Harbor because of their greed for oil and land.
Over 2,400 people died, 1,178 were wounded, 188 aircraft were destroyed.
America retaliated on Japan by declaring war and dropping bombs on Japan's capital.
Pearl Harbor lasted 90 minutes.
7th, 1941, the Navy base known as Pearl Harbour was bombed by the Japanese Navy fleet, which led to a devastating outcome, forcing America to join World War II. Later they declared war on Tokyo on December 8th, 1941. This malicious attack happened at 7:55 a.m. Honolulu time. Overall, the Americans lost 2,400 people, with 1,178 people wounded, 12 ships and 164 aircraft, whilst Japan only lost 64 people, 5 ships and 29 planes.
Most people thought that it wasn't planned, but in fact it was being planned for months because Japan wanted to conquer all of Asia and Hawaii because they would be a good place to go if they attacked the countries. All their oil supply would be gone, and they also wanted to narrow down the US Navy fleet.
Overall, the Americans did end up recovering after this malicious attack, and overall it has 2 memorials that are still standing today in memory of what was lost that fateful day.
The attack on Pearl Harbour.
When Japan bombed Pearl Harbour, the US joined World War II and Japan went back to their own little country.
Members of the US Marine Corps serving in Hawaii honour their peers killed at Pearl Harbour.
Sunday, December the 7th, 1941 was meant to be a day of rest for military soldiers at Hawaii Pearl Harbour, but Japanese planes came flying in without a warning and attacked United States Pacific fleets. Thousands of people died on that horrendous day.
Franklin Delano was President of the United States at the time of the terrible attack on Pearl Harbour.
You might be wondering, why did they do it? Well, here is why.
Japanese has been planning this operation on Pearl Harbour for ages. Japan intended the attack as a preventive action.
Aim was to prevent the United States Pacific Fleet from interfering with its planned military actions in Southeast Asia against overseas territories of the UK, the Netherlands.
They had to stop their war with China to try to defeat the Americans.
But as soon as they bombed Pearl Harbour, Americans declared war.
The attack on Pearl Harbour.
Pearl Harbour was a small island located in the middle of the Pacific Ocean.
Pearl Harbour was the naval base and headquarters of the US Pacific Fleet.
This attack on Pearl Harbour was on December the 7th, 1941, 7:55.
On December the 7th, 1941, at 7:55 a.m., the Japanese military launched a surprise attack on the United States naval base at Pearl Harbour, Hawaii. Since early 1941, the US had been supplying Great Britain in its fight against the Nazis. It has also been pressuring Japan to halt its military expansion in Asia and the Pacific.
Japan attacked Pearl Harbour because they wanted to prevent the United States fleet from stopping the Japanese from taking over Southeast Asia.
2,400 people were killed, 1,178 people wounded, 12 ships sunk, 164 aircraft lost in the United States Army.
However, 64 people killed, 5 ships sunk, and 29 planes destroyed in the Japanese army.
After the attack, President Franklin D. Roosevelt of the United States declared war on Japan, which got America involved in World War II. By Layla and Abby.
Located in the middle of the Pacific Ocean lays Pearl Harbour in Hawaii, where it all starts. On the 7th of December 1941, the Japanese launched a sneak attack on the American naval base in Pearl Harbour. The Japanese launched fighter planes off of aircraft and launched torpedoes at the American Navy base Pearl Harbour. Sadly, during this event, 2,403 Americans were killed and 129 Japanese soldiers were killed during Pearl Harbor surprise attack.
The response of the Americans was by bombing the capital of Japan, Tokyo.
This led to many of the citizens of Tokyo dying.
It also took 2 years to rebuild Pearl Harbor back to its normal and visual self.
Pearl Harbor, 1941.
The 7th of December 1941 at 7:55 on a Sunday morning, the citizens of the United States were disturbed, badly injured or killed due to the bombing by the Japanese air forces.
This caused heaps of destruction and got the US more involved in World War II than ever before.
So much destruction that in fact it ended up killing 2,403 civilians. The leader of the attack on Pearl Harbor was Yamamoto Iskaru.
The reason why this happened was because Japanese wanted to move into the Dutch and claim territory.
At noon on April the 18th, 1942, the citizens of Tokyo looked up into the sky and saw the impossible. It was Americans dropping bombs on Japan. It took over 2 years to rebuild Pearl Harbor.
On the 7th of December 1941, Japan surprise attacked Pearl Harbor at 7:55 on a Sunday morning. Pearl Harbor was an American lagoon on the islands of Ohio, Hawaii.
Who was involved? Japan was the main attackers on the United States. But why? Japan wanted to prevent the United States Pacific Fleet from military action in South Asia. 2,403 US died, but only 129 Japanese died. Japanese left US in shock and fear and anger.